Okay, hello Year 6 and welcome to Lesson 10 for History, Unit 1. Okay, and what we're going to look at today is how the Australian Federation changed the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Okay, so that's what we're going to do today. You're going to learn about their experiences and how things changed for them or stayed the same. You may remember way back in, I think it was lesson 4, when we looked at how people were either for or against Federation. And you may remember there was an Aboriginal man there who was against Federation because he was concerned that his rights would be taken away. And he was right. He had every right to be concerned because Federation did change the experiences of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and not in a good way. Okay? His rights were changed and not for the better. Because when the Australian Constitution was written, way back between 1898 and 1901, the Aboriginal peoples were not given the same rights as non-Indigenous people, and the Torres Strait Islander people, they were not even mentioned at all. So it's fair to say that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people experienced discrimination. Well, that's quite a big word, but all it means is it's been unjust and unfair, okay? It's an unjust and unfair treatment of people or a group of people based on their race, so where they're from or their colour, their age, how old they are, or their gender, so whether they're male or female. So discrimination doesn't just happen to people based on the colour of their skin or where they're from, it also happens based on whether you're a girl or a boy, male or female, etc., or how old you are. So that's discrimination. So the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people experienced discrimination after Federation. And before. If we go and look for information about this situation and what happened to the Aboriginal people and their rights and the Torres Strait Islander people and their rights, we would have to look for information in books, on the internet. We might find information in an encyclopedia, we might find it on a poster, okay? And when we find information about Aboriginals and how they were discriminated against, all right, we call it a source. Okay, so the information is called a source of information. So it could be like this timeline here down below, we're calling that source A. It could be a timeline, it could be a poster, it could be a piece of information from a book, but we call it a source of information in the subject of history. So anytime we're referring to source, we're just referring to some information that we found based on a topic. Alright, now this source here, source A, and you can find that on sheet 11, okay, so have a look at it if you can't see it properly on here, and it shows a timeline of Australia's changing policies. Okay, so policies were how we were governed and how we were ruled. So this is a timeline showing Australia's changing policies, mainly related to the rights and experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So for example, here you can see in 1901 the Australian Constitution was written. In 1902 the Commonwealth Franchise Act came out. 1962 the Commonwealth Franchise Act was amended, so it was changed. 1967 a referendum was held, and we'll talk about these later. And 1975 Racial Discrimination Act was written in. Let's have a look at some of the points that were included in the Constitution before we start talking about how they changed. Let's look at what it actually said. So when you look here, you will see that in section 51 here of our Constitution, it gave the Commonwealth Parliament, say that's our federal, our whole country, the government who runs the whole country, power to make laws for people of any race except for the Aboriginal race, where it was the responsibility of the states to make their own special laws. So that means Queensland could make up their own set of laws for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, so could, well, Aboriginal people, so could the New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, Tasmania. They could all make up their own laws for Aboriginal people. So you could see that that's going to smell trouble. There's trouble there. And finally, section 127 here, it said that Aboriginal natives of the Commonwealth of Australia would not be counted when holding a population census. So when they counted how many people were living and working in Australia, they decided that the Aboriginal people would not even be counted. They did not, in the Constitution, did not even mention Torres Strait Islander people at all. So there were some things that the states controlled, and that was things such as the possession of alcohol. You can see them listed down here. Okay, the supply and possession of alcohol, work conditions for people, the right to marry freely, okay, whoever they wanted, when they wanted, freedom of movement, okay, to move around the state and between states, guardianship of children, okay, who had the right to care for a child, and the right to vote in elections. South Australia was the only state where Aboriginal men and women were entitled to vote at that time. So imagine if you were living in your own country and you were then told that no, you couldn't have a beer, okay, if you were of the right age. You can work for me, but I will pay you half the amount. You can't marry who you want to. You can't move around where you want to. No, you cannot have and keep your own children because I don't believe that you can care for them. And you're not necessarily given the right to vote. So these are the kinds of things that the Aboriginal people were experiencing after Federation. The states made up their own laws. But things eventually changed. But can you remember what a referendum is? Because this made all the difference in Australia in 1967. So a referendum, if you can remember, is just a yes or no vote. So the people of Australia would get together and they would vote yes or no for the Constitution to be changed. So in 1967, Australia had a referendum. And the purpose of the referendum, and you can turn to lesson 10 now, page 4, and you'll see letter I here, question I. It's asking you what the purpose of the 1967 referendum was. Now the purpose of the referendum was to change, or to put to the Australian people whether or not they wanted to change the Constitution so the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people had rights within our country. So you can actually type in there the purpose of the referendum, okay, to remove the discrimination that was in the Australian Constitution. Australian laws would then apply to all people equally. Okay, so meaning the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people would have the same rights as the white Australians. What was the outcome of that referendum? Now this is quite substantial in our history. Okay, so you think at the time, what were people thinking? How did they feel about the experiences of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? Well, when they had the referendum to remove the discrimination in the Constitution, 90.77% voted yes. Okay, it's time to remove the discrimination from the Constitution. Next one. How were the status and rights of Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islander peoples affected by the referendum? Well, it would mean that, capitals still, that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people would be counted in the Australian census, okay, to say that they are actually living in this country. Australian census. The census tells us who's here and what's happening, what they're doing, okay, what people are doing. Okay, so they would be voted in this counted into the census, and they would also have the same rights as every other Australian citizen. Okay, so we had a 1967 referendum, a yes or no vote. The outcome was 90.77% voted yes. Okay, and how did this change? Well, the discrimination was taken away from the Constitution. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people would be counted in the census, and they would have the same rights as every other Australian citizen. Okay, sorry, I'll go back to there. Okay, now, so as you can see, there was a lot of time though between when the Constitution was brought in and then way over to 1967 here. So at 66 years before this actually happened. So within those 66 years between 1901 and 1967, there was a lot of problems and terrible experiences for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of Australia. So here's another source of information, and we're calling this source F, and it is a picture, it's a photograph. And it's labelled the Aboriginal Day of Mourning, because what we're going to do is start learning about some of these terrible experiences or unfair experiences that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people had between the years of 1901 and 1967. So this is a black and white photograph, and it's taken of some Indigenous people who took part in what they call the Day of Mourning. Now the Day of Mourning took place on the 26th of January 1938. So the 26th of January might be ringing a bell in your head right now, and you'd be right, because it's what we know as Australia Day today. Okay, when Captain Cook came and discovered Australia and landed, so we celebrate it as Australia Day. But in this case, the Aboriginal people were calling it the Day of Mourning. So you might want to think about why that could be. Okay, there are people in this photo. We've got William Ferguson, Jack Kinchela, Helen Grosvenor, Selena Patton, and some children at the front too. The large blackboard here says Aborigines Conference, Day of Mourning, Aborigines only. 2 people are holding the sign. Okay, and Aborigines claim citizen rights. Now this is in 1938. So this is in that time where the rights were taken away from the Aboriginal people. So you can see why they would be upset. They weren't allowed to marry who they wanted. Sometimes they weren't allowed to look after their own children. Okay, so you can understand why there would be protests and anger. So using that source here, we're going to answer some questions that are on page 5 of lesson 10. So go and turn to page 5 of lesson 10. Alright, so who is included in the photograph? Now we mentioned some names, so I think there was Jack Kinchela, Helen Grosvenor. Okay, there was children. Alright, and you can actually look back onto your source, onto sheet 11 if you want to write everyone's names down, but 3 is fine. Okay, what event are they attending? Now in this case, do you remember what it's looking back? The Aboriginal Day of Mourning. Okay, so we'd write that in here. What is the date of the event? Okay, so can you remember the year and the date? So we could read that over here, and you may be able to see the date. There it is. Okay, we need to write this date into the next box. January 26th, 1938. Okay, Why would 26th of January be significant to Australia? Well, we know that, don't we? We've talked about that one. This is known as Australia Day. Okay, the day Captain Cook discovered Australia. Okay, for what rights are the protesters asking? So let's have a look back at our source. What are they looking for here? They're looking for citizen rights. Okay, citizen, oops, rights. What rights did the Aboriginals people and Torres Strait Islander peoples not have in 1938? Now you can remember we talked about those things. You'd write them in here. They could not marry. Sometimes they couldn't look after their own children. Sometimes they did not have equal pay. They could be doing the same job for less pay. So write a few of those things in here. Okay, also they couldn't vote. Sorry, one thing to remember there, that they weren't allowed to vote in elections. Alright, and finally, G, how did this affect their status in society and or government? Now this is up to you, it's your own personal opinion here, but basically it gave them a lot less rights than every other citizen. That other people had control over their lives and they didn't have the opportunity to make their own choices. Okay, when you finish writing in those two answers, we'll swap pages. Okay, so let's continue on and go to the next source of information that you can also see in sheet 11. This is a referendum poster. Okay, and let's have a look what this referendum poster says. Right wrongs. Right yes for Aborigines on May 27. So this is a poster from the time 1967 when that referendum, that yes and no vote was happening about the rights and whether or not we should rewrite the Constitution so it is not discriminating against the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So this is made for the Australian people who were allowed to vote at the time to say, come on, there's been a lot of bad things happen in the past. Let's right these wrongs, whether it be taking children, whether it be not allowing Aborigines to have work for equal pay, etc. Let's make a change. And so that's what this is probably handed out at the elections for people to convince them to vote yes. Okay. So we're calling this source G, okay, another source of information. So who is shown in the poster? So if you look over here, who is shown? Okay, now it's not just a baby, it's an Aboriginal baby. Okay, so the Aboriginal baby, and it's a close-up of the baby, right? And for a baby who has no chance to speak their own, what they want for themselves, and so they're trying to say to the Australian people, this baby deserves as much rights as any other baby. Okay, so who is shown in this poster? Okay, an Aboriginal baby. To what event is this poster referring? Now remember the event we talked about, and you can see it up here in the title, is the referendum of 1967. What is the main message of the poster? And of course, we just mentioned that too. The main message of the poster is, you can write your own words in here. We can write to ask the Australian people to vote yes on the referendum. So the rights of Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islander, can be changed. Alright, I'll change that so you can see it. I hope I can change it so you can see it. There we go. Right, what techniques has the artist used to convince the viewer to vote yes? Okay, so the baby was used basically to try and get some sympathy from the from the Australian people. And I think that's fair enough because these babies don't have a choice at the time of who they are in this country. Okay, so they are innocent people. They wanted to convince the Australian people that it was up to them to be able to right the wrongs for these children that were coming up in the society and people who had been living with this discrimination for so long. Okay. All right. Reflect on the impact of the 1967 referendum and write short answers to the following questions. Okay. 90.77% of people voted yes. What does this tell you about people's attitudes towards Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders peoples in 1967? Well, it's definitely that there's a huge change, okay, between what used to be a very discriminating point of view to now that these people deserve equal rights, the same as white Australian people. So that's the vote with being 90.77% yes is that people's attitudes were positive towards the Indigenous Australians, saying yes, they deserve equal rights. So you can put that in your own words in this section here. Okay, so you need to put in your own words why or what does 90.77%, okay, the vote, they said yes. What does this tell you about people's attitudes towards Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders? And we just talked about this one, how these attitudes different to the attitudes in 1901 or 1962. Okay. People no longer believed that rights should be based on race. Okay. Now that makes a big difference because of course that is discrimination. Okay, and people were starting to change their minds and see the difference and see how unfair and unjust it is. Okay, so we've looked at changes and how things have changed for the Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islander people between just after Federation right up to 1967 with the referendum. And we've looked at continuities. So changes are things that change and continuities are things that stay the same. Okay, so we're going to identify those continuities and changes in the rights and experiences of Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia since Federation. Okay, so let's have a look at some changes. All right, changes. In 1901 and 1902, the states controlled the Aboriginal people's affairs, remembering they could say what the Aboriginal people could do. Each state separately, Queensland, South Australia, New South Wales, they all had separate laws for the Aboriginal people. The right to vote was lost for the South Australian Aboriginal people. So after Federation, the South Australian people Aboriginal people were not allowed to vote. So there's some changes. But things that stayed the same, okay, after Federation was the same rights and status as non-Indigenous were denied. So the Indigenous people did not have the same rights as white Australia at the time. That stayed the same. And rights varied from state to state. Well, that was happening before Federation. It happened even more after Federation. It changed quite significantly to be even more unfair. Okay, now let's have a look at 1962. In 1962, they amended the Commonwealth Franchise Act, and they actually said that yes, okay, Aboriginal people will have the right to vote. They'll have the right to enrol to vote. Okay, so here they'll have the right to enrol to vote in 1962, which is great. But at the same time, they didn't have to. Okay, so their vote still wasn't counted as important. Things that stayed the same. things that stayed the same, I'll have to change the size of my font here to make it smaller. It's basically the same as 1901. They still did not have the same rights, okay? They did not have the same rights as non-Indigenous people. Okay, they did not have the same rights as non-Indigenous people. That stayed the same. And then here, rights still varied from state to state, even in 1962. And after they were allowed to enrol to vote, okay, they still had different laws from state to state. So rights varied from state to state. Okay, you can be writing this down, please, on page 7 of lesson 10 if you're not already. Okay, and now of course the big change here, 1967 referendum. Okay, the 1960 referendum, 67, changes did occur. Okay, changes did occur. So what changes occurred? The Aboriginal people were actually counted in the census of Australia. Okay, so we can put here, keeps changing my font to bigger size. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were counted in the census. Okay, not only that, the states couldn't make up their own laws now for the Aboriginal people. Okay, they would have the same rights as non-Indigenous people. Okay, so the Commonwealth or the federal government were responsible for everyone's rights, and so the Indigenous people now came under the same umbrella as everybody else. Now what stayed the same, okay, after that referendum? What stayed the same? Well, in theory nothing. Okay, in theory everything changed after that date. Things have happened after that date, and sometimes people have said that their rights stayed the same and didn't change much at all after 1967. But in theory, nothing changed after the 1967. Sorry, nothing stayed the same after the 1967 referendum, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people were allowed to vote, marry freely, work for equal pay. Alright, and lastly, guys, so today we were looking at the experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and how the things that they experienced after Federation between 1901 and 1967. So let's see if you can answer these questions based on what we did. Let's look at A. Many Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islander peoples actually had more rights before Federation. Is that true or is it false? Okay. Yep, it's true. Okay. Many did have more rights before Federation, so you can see why they were against it. B. After being granted the right to vote federally, okay, being granted the vote after 1967, Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people were still not encouraged to enrol to vote. Okay, now this is true. Okay, even though they were allowed to, they weren't encouraged by other people to say, yeah, go and put your name down to have a go. Okay, and a lot of time, because of their language barrier, they found it hard to understand, as they might have been not spoken English as a first language. And so it was still quite a bit of discrimination against them. Okay, C. 1967 referendum was just another example of how willing Australians were to make changes to the Constitution. Okay, absolutely. 1967 with a 90.77% voting yes, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should have the same rights as us. That is showing that most Australians were willing to make the changes in the Constitution so they could have the same rights. Okay, Thank you very much for coming to the lesson, and I hope that this all made sense. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.